right, today I'm going to do a quick video over the poetry selections um, that you were to read this week. And you had two poems to read. This first one, Dulce et Decorum Est, I'm going to go into in some detail. I have a PowerPoint on that one. And then the second poem, Richard Cory, I'm going to comment on just a little bit. But for this one, I'm having you write a little reflection and dig into it yourself a little deeper. So you'll do a little more work on that one on your own. But make sure that you've read both of these poems. This handout entitled Poetry Selections can be found in the Notes and Videos folder in week 6. So go ahead and pull that up, make sure you've read it. And then you have some notes on analyzing poetry. So let me just talk through this really quickly. First of all, what distinguishes poetry from prose? And poetry is different in a lot of ways than a short story or a novel or even just, a nonfiction essay or nonfiction creative writing piece, and that it's more of an art form. Language is used in poetry in a very distinctive way. There are a lot of poetic devices that are used, such as metaphor and simile. And you guys are familiar with that. You've learned about poetry before. And in general, poetry is shorter than other works of literature. Although there are some really long poems. You may have read Beowulf in high school or something like that. So there are some long ones out there, usually the older ones. These are some terms you need to know. Figurative language is just kind of an umbrella term for a lot of various types of poetic devices, such as metaphor, simile, personification, imagery. Those are all types of figurative language because they're types of comparisons. And then I have some examples here. The difference between a metaphor and a simile is a simile uses words such as like or as to draw the connection, whereas a metaphor is more direct comparison. Imagery is just the use of sensory details to create a picture, which almost all poems use good imagery. Personification, treating an abstraction, so, either an abstraction or some non-human thing like an animal or an object as if it were a person. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. Understatement is the opposite. And you guys know alliteration, repetition of consonant sounds, like those old nursery rhymes, Peter Pepper picked a pipe, a pickle. See, I got it all wrong. I can't do alliteration. But you get the idea. A verbal irony, using words to convey a meaning that is the opposite of the literal meaning. And we'll look at some examples of that. Okay, so you need to know those terms. Dulce et Decorum Est, it's good for you to know a little background information about the author. Wilfred Owen fought in World War II, and he wrote a lot of war poetry. That was pretty unusual for this time period. And this poem is just a great example of recognizing literary devices in poetry and how those devices create meaning. And it is important, I had this note on the handout, that you understand this Latin phrase means it is fitting and sweet to die for your fatherland. So that's important. So I'm just going to walk you through this line by line. So these first two lines, we see the use of simile. So what Owen is doing is he's discussing these soldiers, and he describes them as very old men, beggars, knock-kneed, coughing like hags. And what's interesting is in World War II, most of the foot soldiers especially were really young. Some of them lied about their age and were only maybe 15 or 16 years old. And so what he's saying, he's using these similes to convey the message that war ages people prematurely. So you can see right from the beginning, this is not, his view of war is very realistic and really quite negative, and this is based on his own experiences. So then, as we move forward, again, he's describing the march here, and we see the use of hyperbole. When he says that men marched to sleep, and all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf to, the bombing happening all around them. And, that's exaggeration. They didn't all go blind, and they weren't literally asleep or drunk or deaf. But what he does here is he's creating a very vivid image for us to understand how extreme the conditions were. So it's really good use of hyperbole. And then here in this stanza, there's quite a bit going on. And so we have this idea of, this platoon or troop that there's been some mustard gas, which was a really horrific device used in World War II. And as soon as it came, they had to get their gas masks on really quickly. And here he uses verbal irony. The word ecstasy, now in our culture we tend to think about drugs, but the word ecstasy means utter happiness and utter joy. And certainly that's the opposite of what they felt. They felt utter horror and utter panic at the idea that if you did not get your gas mask on quick enough, then you were surely going to die a horrific death. And so then he actually describes this one man who wasn't able to get his gas mask on, and so they had to just stand there and watch him die. And so it's interesting, this imagery, he talks about him floundering through these misty panes and thick green light, so we can just see that thick cloud of gas just enveloping this person as under a green sea. I saw him drowning. And that comparison really is quite apt, because essentially you suffocated it. This gas got in your lungs, and then you could no longer, it corrupted your lungs so that you couldn't get oxygen. And so he uses this amazing vivid imagery, and you really can picture it in your mind. And that's the mark of a powerful poem, is that it takes you there. You can see the image that the author is trying to convey. And then again, we have repetition here, guttering, choking, drowning. That repetition of the ing verbs emphasizes this action, which is a really interesting and powerful contrast to the narrator, who just, you can't do anything. There's no saving this person at this point. And he talks about how he sees this in his dreams. So pretty powerful stuff. And then in this, as we're moving towards the end of the poem, he starts with this if then. If you, and he's addressing his audience for the first time, if you could walk in my shoes and walk behind this wagon where we had to place his body, and he has this really powerful, somewhat graphic imagery of this, this soldier's face, how you could still hear the gargling of the blood in his lungs. And he even uses sensory imagery, the bitterness that they tasted. Obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vial. And he has this internal alliteration, white eyes writhing. And so there's all this tension going on. So he starts with the if, right? If you could be there and see what I see. Then he moves to the then. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. And then we have this Latin phrase. So this whole description is a build-up to basically say that this Latin phrase, that it's honorable and a beautiful thing to die for your country. He's like, that's a lie. And so finally we understand his message and the purpose. He wants people to speak the hard truth about war instead of making it sound like this glorious, beautiful thing. So, and then, we have some more context here, and I'm not going to read over all this, but basically Wilfred Owen, it was a new type of war poetry. A lot of poetry about war up to this point had been very patriotic, if I can use that word, and not that that's a bad thing, but he just wanted to show a more realistic view of war, and he got a lot of criticism for that. But his poetry is quite valued as being a very realistic account of World War II. All right, so that's that. And again, this is just an idea of how we analyze poetry. How do you read it and pick it apart? You're looking at how the poet uses language. So this other poem, Richard Cory, is about a person. And what's interesting here, I'm just going to point out a few things, is that the narrator of the poem is actually the townspeople. It's like a plural first person. We people on the pavement. So it's told from the perspective of the town. They say whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. And there we see some nice alliteration. And then there's all this description of Richard Cory. And apparently he was a good looking guy, right? Clean favored. But he was human when he talked. So he was a nice guy. He fluttered pulses when he said good morning, which is kind of an indication that he, was so good looking that, the ladies were, impressed. He was a sought after young man. And even this idea that he glittered, he was so good looking and clean and wealthy that everyone, he just kind of had this aura about him. And then this description that he's richer than a king, he's schooled in every grace, so he's educated. Basically, and they even say, we thought he was everything to make us wish we were in his place. So he was that guy, right? He was that guy in town who had it all. He had status, he had wealth, he had good looks, he had the personality. But then Robinson has this turn at the end of the poem, this really intense turn. So on we worked, waited for the light, went without the meat, cursed the bread. So the townspeople are, in contrast to Richard Cory, they're very, they're more impoverished. They have to work. They don't get to have steak every night, right? So we have this contrast of them being impoverished to Richard Cory's wealth. However, it says at the end, Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So there's that shock of his suicide at the end. And of course, the great irony is he's described as having everything, and yet he took his life one calm summer night, which even makes the shock even more kind of jolting, right? When you read that, because there's no indication of that bullet coming. It's just boom, out of nowhere. And so I have you for your blog post. You are basically just going to watch a couple little videos, because this is such a timeless idea of what someone looks like on the outside is not an indication of their inner soul. And so I have you guys kind of contemplate that and write a little reflection about it. There's a couple different videos I have you watch that I provide the links for. So really, take your time, read through this poem a couple times, and really think through it. And I'll point out one more thing. It's interesting that even though Richard Cory has all these things, he is very isolated, which is in contrast to the collective narrator, right? So the people on the pavement might be poor, but they at least have community, right? They have this sense of togetherness that Richard Cory lacks. So there's this distance between the townspeople and Richard Cory. So that isolation is a really interesting contrast that sets Richard Cory apart, that I think kind of emphasizes what Robinson is trying to say here. So anyway, so take the time to write that blog post. It's very short, a couple paragraphs, 250 words. Really, guys, it's an easy 15 points. Just follow the directions. I'm not going to be grading really tough for grammar or anything. Just, make sure that you complete it on time and you'll get those easy 15 points. As always, let me know if you have any questions.